Throughout America's history, it's clear to see the devastation that racism has brought upon wide sections of its populace, wreaking havoc through the oppressive forces on the world and constituting an injustice to a wide variety of its people. Yet even today, this specter that haunts our country still shrieks its head in our day to day lives. However, many Americans fail to see just how this oppressive force exists in our modern society. Enter the role of critical theory. Originally devised by the philosophers of the Frankfurt School to both critique and analyze the social aspects of our society through a Marxist lens. The tools that they have devised through their theory have evolved since their conception. However, the core root of the application is now used for a variety of fields, where we can see the descendants of critical theory emerge. One such example is within the anthology Rereading America, published in 2019, where one can examine the piece Theories and Concepts of Race, which is a short reading from Media Messages, What Film, Television, and Popular Music Teach Us About Race, Class, Gender, and Sexual Orientation, that was originally published in 2014 by the authors Linda Holtzman and Leon Sharp. The piece details some of the core findings and ideas of critical race theory, and attempted to display its validity as a lens through which to view the modern state of race in America to an educated and leftist audience. And in this act, I find them to be somewhat successful. Within the text, the authors succeed at showcasing and analyzing racism in modern America through the development of their reasoning as they've put forward. However, the overall coherence of the essay is lacking somewhat due to the structuring and other factors. This essay will mainly be focusing on the structure and coherence, first by analyzing the general structure of the entire piece, then focusing on the questionable inclusion of a section of the article. When building a structure for any sort of writing, there are often commonplace assumptions as to how to structure the argument to make it as effective as possible. Yet, in this piece of writing, it disregards these notions in its structure without a clear benefit to this decision. But in most pieces of writing, a commonplace pattern is setting up context and background knowledge, interpreting these bits of information, followed by explaining the consequences of the information, and finally by prescribing some sort of method to enact a plan based off the insights that can be used and gathered by interpreting the info. However, this is by no means the case that occurs in this writing. If one were to observe the general structure of the body of the article, one will find that Holtzman and Sharp detail the impacts first on page 633 in The Social and Psychological Impact of Race, followed by some historical and scientific context in The Science and Pseudoscience of Race on page 636, and then finishing with interpretation of racial theory on page 637 with stories and counter-stories decoding the master script. The fact that they went against this general structure isn't the issue that I'm critiquing itself, but rather that they did so in a way that did not establish more coherence for the audience. When adhering to the structure I outlined before, it reflects the general human pathway of obtaining knowledge, making observances, and reflecting upon it, and finally taking some sort of action to actually be able to address it. This is a very logical way for the layout of information, and as a result of the lack of its presence in this piece, it can be clearly observed to be a negative phenomenon when compounded by other critiques of organization, structure, and overall coherence. We can generally examine the overall structure of the piece as well by breaking it down into 5 sections, with the introduction starting on page 630, on page 633, the social and psychological impact of race, on 636, the science and pseudoscience of race, followed on page 637 with the stories and counter-stories decoding the master script, and finally, the summary on page 639. This main piece of part of the essay that I have contention with is the inclusion of the 3rd section, Science and Pseudoscience of Race. Within the introduction of this piece, Holtzman and Sharp state on page 632, while race itself is a fiction, the consequences of racism are a historical and contemporary fact of American life, which about entirely sums up the general message of the 2nd section. Throughout the later section of the text, authors continue to hammer this message across by citing several signs and several studies alleging that a biological nature for race does not exist, and this is established on pages 636 and pages 637. The reason that I have a contention with this edition is due to the fact that the whole purpose of the essay is revolving around and detailing the consequences of race in everyday American life. Regardless of whether or not race as a biological function exists, the consequences of it are clearly felt and harmful to a wide variety of people. And the inclusion of this section actually obfuscates this fact. With the author treating race this way, it becomes a sort of Schrodinger's cat, leaving in both the quantum state of real and not real, a scientific, pseudoscientific, biological marker, but also a phenomenon that coincides with the vast and drastic effects on millions of people. If Holtzman and Sharp truly want to stem the tide of racism in America, the inclusion of this section only ties down their argument in the weeds when it approaches its contractors. The author doesn't have to acknowledge race as a biological factor to make their argument more valid, as it isn't a biological factor, but the current inclusion of this section only detracts from the current piece. Its current purpose is to counteract a viewpoint that the audience likely just doesn't have, regardless of whether or not they would even believe in race as a biological level, due to the fact that so much of the audience is probably left leaning and highly educated. It's highly unlikely that they would even ever advocate for any sort of discrimination against those individuals or decline to accept the merits of utilizing critical race theory. In conclusion, this article from Holtzman and Sharp suffers very much due to poor organizational and structural choices that impact the overall coherence of the essay. However, these issues mainly result from both the order of implementation of each of the sections of the body of the essay, alongside the inclusion of a section that did not add much to further the purpose of the paper, but rather helped to hurt the overall coherence of the essay. Because the organization of an essay is often overlooked, the implications that it can have on the coherence of the essay is massive, leading towards a make or break effect on how accessible the information is upon the reader. Holtzman and Sharp do a great job at providing thorough and reasonable justifications for their claims, but their organizational skills are lacking the required necessary adjustments to do them justice.